So this is actually from Tucker Carlson. It's direct transcript here. So Canada has now become an atheist totalitarian state with amazing speed. And in Canada, it's now a crime to object to sexualized drag shows for children. You're not allowed to say a word. Late last month, a pastor in Calgary was violently thrown out of an all ages, in other words, for children, drag queen story hour for daring to object to the sexualization of children. Who committed the violence in that video? The guy on the ground was the pastor. Before we answer the question, some context will remind you that in Canada, showing any disloyalty at all to the Trudeau government could get your bank account frozen and your truck seized. So maybe you're not surprised to learn that that man on the ground, his name is Pastor Derek Reimer, who showed profound disrespect for Justin Trudeau's ongoing efforts to sexualize children and mutilate the genitals of children. Woke up yesterday to the police banging on his door and telling him he was going to be arrested. And this is the transcript from that interaction with the police. Why are you showing up at my home? You guys could have called me. You could have called me. This is the police officer. We need to talk about what happened over the weekend at Seton, right? Why do we need to talk about it? Because you're going to be arrested for it and charged. So we can deal with it this morning, or I can just put warrants out for you. Charged with what? Mischief and causing a disturbance. So that was directly the transcript from the interaction between Derek and the police officer. So this is back to Tucker here. Where are all the professional Christians? You have to wonder that again. Where's David French and Beth Moore and Tim Keller and all these people who are defending Christianity as actual Christians are being arrested for being Christians? Not a word. Well, today, Pastor Derek Reimer confirmed that a warrant was out for his arrest for hate crimes, and he was right about that. He was not overstating it because this afternoon, he was literally arrested. So I thought that was interesting because for those who don't know, Tucker Carlson is the largest name in news in general. Like, he gets the most hits on his nightly show, and he specifically called out a bunch of people that we would consider to be part of Big Eva, is the term that's been thrown around a lot. Just meaning influential people within the church as speakers, pastors, authors, all of the above. And I thought it was really interesting that he made a point to call those people out on his incredibly popular nightly news show. But Michael, what was your initial reaction to that?
Well, there's so much, because there's the actual story of the pastor himself. Then there's, of course, what Carlson is saying about it as well. Going back to the original story, I didn't watch the film that was taken of his interaction at the show, the drag show. What was the nature of his disturbance?
Unfortunately, and this is where, you could critique Carlson for it if you want, but there was not film of the interaction before he was kind of being thrown out. But as he was being thrown out, he was basically saying like, this is wrong, you should repent, this is wrong, and then he got shoved onto the ground. So that's kind of the only context that was really given. If there was more video, I haven't seen it. I don't think anything has come out of that, and that could just be because it wasn't on tape. But obviously he was trying to disrupt the drag queen story hour. So I don't know to what degree he was, I don't think there was any violence. If there was, I think we definitely would have heard about that. I think the police officers would have mentioned that. They said that he was charged with basically causing mischief. And so my guess would be he was probably trying to be loud and disruptive.
There's actual violence and there's perceived violence. And the perceived violence falls under the category of, you said something I disagree with, therefore I'm being attacked.
Right.
Which sounds more like what some people would categorize this as. So that's pretty much my assumption as well, even though of course I don't know. My guess is that he was in protest, and protest was unlawful in this case because it was protesting an agenda.
Yeah.
So clearly that shows the state of Canada, Canada for what it is.
What's the difference? Go
Well,
ahead.
there's still a big difference somehow.
There is, thankfully.
But lesser so than other states, but I digress. Yeah, for Tucker to go out and call out Big Eva, I mean, he's saying the quiet part out loud, right? It's the part that we've said on other stances before, and on one hand, it's like, would they have said something if given time? Probably not. Not all of them. I think McDonald might. I don't know. There's.
Do you mean MacArthur?
MacArthur. What did I say?
You said McDonald. You did that in the previous episode too. That's great.
I don't know. I have books by both McDonald and MacArthur, and I get that mixed up. So, yeah, John MacArthur probably would be one that I could see speaking out earlier than any of the other listed individuals. But those are the same individuals that kind of showed their hand during COVID as well, and showed that they were willing to go belly up and kind of submit to the governing authority, is probably how they would say it. And, what's our response to that? Well, maybe they're justified because they're still pursuing the work of the kingdom in the midst of the tyranny. But perhaps the work of the kingdom is in opposition to the tyranny. So, I don't know. Yeah. It's a hard thing to tell. And I do honestly think that God has not called all of us to act in the same way against specific things. However, he has called all of us to specific standards of ethics. And I think this pastor who is in opposition to what's going on is doing exactly what he should do. But how many other pastors who are Bible-believing, faithful individuals are not at the drag show and not in opposition, or they're not actively in opposition, but they're in opposition ideologically? And does that mean they're not doing enough? I don't know. So in the same way, you can look at the big leaders and say, okay, they're not calling out this tyranny. So does that mean they're not doing enough, or are they just serving God faithfully in their own communities? And I think what it comes down to is when you have a platform like Timothy Keller, the others you mentioned, goodness,
David French and Beth Moore.
Yeah. Like Beth Moore, she's got an audience, and she has for decades.
Yeah.
So what she says from that platform is a reflection of her ministry. No, she tries to encourage people a lot, and she tries to be uplifting, and there's lots of ideas there. Tim Keller has written a lot of really good works. He's done a lot for the church, I believe. But could he do more? Of course. We could all do more. And I don't know. I think it's hard for me to start pointing fingers.
Right.
It's good that Tucker Carlson is calling it out. But I don't know if it's appropriate entirely for him to be pointing fingers at other evangelical leaders. However, he's not wrong either. So,
yeah, and I think from my end, because I'm not a confrontational person, and that might shock people to hear, because I have a podcast that talks about politics. But the reality is, it took me a long time to really wrestle with the idea of even having this type of a platform, because I'm not a confrontational person. So that being said, I don't like to call out people individually, but I think it warrants a discussion, at least, not necessarily because we're here to call people out, but because there are trends that we can see with people. Like, for example, David French. I mean, I barely know his work, but every little bit that I've been exposed to, like, I will never try to question someone's salvation, but I do question his choices. That's for sure. Now, I wanted to bring up an actual example of someone who actually did respond to Tucker, who is considered not as high up in Big Eva, if we're going to keep using that term, as, you know, say Tim Keller or Beth Moore. But this is Mike Cosper, and he responded to it. He responded to it saying, "This is black belt level clown show. The story Tucker is talking about involves a pastor disrupting an event at a public library and refuses to leave. To call this totalitarian is an insult to those who suffer under actual totalitarianism." So that was his initial response, but he's gotten some backlash in the responses. So he actually goes on. He says, "Moreover, calling out Keller at all for failing to defend the faith by not speaking up in defense of the guy creating a physical disturbance is just plain stupid, and made more so by Wolf's claim that this is the most pressing issue of our day. Derek Reimer, the pastor, disrupted a public event and refused to leave. He now faces legal consequences. If I went into McDonald's sans shirt and shoes, demanding Big Macs and playing bagpipes, their refusal to serve me couldn't be chalked up to bagpiper persecution. There's this pretense that, as Kevin Williams recently said, one needs a snowplow attached to your truck to get through the all-age drag queens blocking the way to church on Sunday mornings. Acting like this is the issue in society is both pernicious and dumb. Dumb because it doesn't take a lot of poking around to realize that drag queen story hour, something that is also pernicious and dumb, is hardly a universal phenomenon. The founding organization's website lists about 36 chapters in the US. There are more that are unaffiliated, and there are other events like drag shows at Chuck E. Cheese, and yes, it's pernicious. Calling it sexualizing children is absolutely fair, but it is also nut picking. I'm assuming that's a typo. It is not some universal phenomenon. Here is what is universal. 1/3 of teen girls has seriously considered suicide. 1/5 of teen girls has experienced sexual violence in the past year. 1/10 of teen girls has been forced to have sex. That's the tip of the iceberg. Deaths of despair, addiction, mass loneliness, anxiety, depression. We have a rising generation that is suffering deeply. Some of the cultural malaise, some of its aftershock of childhood and adolescence disrupted by COVID, and in the church. Some of it is in the steady revelation that leaders turn blind eyes to spiritual and sexual abuse. Jesus committed an act of disruptive public violence one time when he turned over the tables in the temple. The authors of the Gospels make special note that he went after those selling doves, the acceptable offering of the poorest. This desire to cosplay at persecution and heroism exhibited by Carlson, Wolf, etc., is a distraction from real suffering and real harm, and far more pernicious than any story hour, regardless of how stupid and insidious that story hour may be. So I'll definitely read some responses to that, because that just continued to get more of a firestorm. But the reason why I bring that up is, I think, important, because what I'm trying to highlight here is there are people that are wanting to say nothing, and then there are people that I think are too quick to dismiss things as, oh, you're just playing at you're playing at the victim of saying, oh, you're so persecuted. But I think that they're doing that to a fault, in my opinion. But I'd like you to respond first, Michael.
The big hole that I saw in the response is he's saying there's greater issues at hand. And yeah, maybe so, because it's not universalized. It's not like every street corner has a drag show for children yet. But the examples that he called upon were young women experiencing a desire for, like, young girls experiencing suicidal thoughts, and over sexualized youths that are being sexually harmed, manipulated, raped, persuaded into having sex. So in the same breath, he says, we can all agree that what's going on with these drag shows is sexualizing children. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is that children are being sexualized.
Exactly. I'm so glad that you caught on to that too.
What? how can you not see that they are related? Now, of course, not every girl who wants to commit suicide or has been raped or has been persuaded into sexual actions is a result of drag shows. That would be
Right.
idiotic to
Of
assume.
course.
But, you know, he kind of made this comment of this isn't the biggest issue in our society. And I want to say it's hard to tell if it's the biggest, but it's up there.
Right.
It is defining our culture. It is defining our media. It is defining our news as well as our uh, movies, sitcoms, TV shows, news feed, the the algorithms that dictate what we're allowed to see on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook. This is all being undermined by this sexually charged agenda to cause people to think a certain way. And drag shows are one small piece in a big puzzle that point to that. So to ignore that is ignorant, I think.
Yeah. And what I think is interesting is I didn't really mention who this was yet to you, but this is Mike Cosper. I'm assuming I'm saying his name correctly, but he is the guy that actually chronicled the abuse of women at Mars Hill.
Mm.
So, a couple of the responses that I thought were interesting, Ryan Visconti and several of these people I'm not super familiar with, but I thought they made good points, and they are when I kind of did some looking into them, they are different authors, influencers within the church. Um, so Ryan Visconti says, "No, Mike, that's basic courage for us regular Jesus people. A drag queen story hour is not a silly, foolish thing to tolerate. The sexual abuse of children is the darkest type of evil. The fact that you don't get that is scary. I guess all of us who want to protect kids are black belt level clowns." Then Joel Berry said, "Wait, wait, wait. Is Mike Cosper, the guy who chronicled the abuse of women at Mars Hill, shrugging off the abuse of little girls by grown men in dresses?" And then last one that I'll read here is from Megan Basham, who's a well-known reporter for Daily Wire and multiple other outlets. She's been with several different Christian outlets over the years as well. She said, "If William Wolf has such a clown show take here, please point me to Christianity Today's coverage of bills currently passing and pending to stop doctors and hospitals from offering puberty blockers and trans surgeries to minors. I'm looking and not finding any." So that to me was really interesting to go back to, Timothy Keller and some of those other big names. Because Megan actually goes on her own feed to kind of give some more context that it was either the Gospel Coalition or Christianity Today. One of those sites basically, oh yeah, it was Christianity Today. There are multiple articles all covering gun control, for example, but nothing on any of these drag queen story hours or legislation being passed that we discussed at the beginning of this episode. I just find that really interesting. And so again, for those who are just tuning in, this is not necessarily us just playing blame game. We're honestly having a speculative conversation about why are certain individuals vocal about telling other individuals, you're being an alarmist about this, but then at the same time, they won't even like bring up that it's happening. And
Mm.
I just thought that was really interesting, but go ahead,
I
Micah.
want to take a moment, if I can, to,
Yeah.
I don't know if empathize is the right word, but at least assume a position of understanding Mike's perspective.
Mm.
Because, and take this with a grain of salt, the individuals who were damaged by Mars Hill and took it upon themselves to document those damages, many of them have taken a position in the public view of saying, how can the church purge sin from culture if it can't purge the sin from within itself? Which is a reasonable thing to say, except that unfortunately it comes at the cost of being accepting or ignorant of the sins of the world. And this goes into a conversation that we've had before where it's like, okay, well, yes, the church should be fixed of its problems, but that doesn't mean that the church should turn a blind eye to the sins of the world either and just continue engaging in the public forum without a problem. Because in this circumstance, if we're going to take Mike's perspective, and this is all speculation, um, if I was going to take Mike's perspective, then I imagine him saying the issues and the grooming and the over sexualization of young women and young boys within the church and the history thereof is equally as damaging as what's going on in a heathen secular outlet. And we should turn our attention to that as a foremost priority. So I might say, like, yeah, you kind of got a point there, but also, what about those of us who go to churches where kids aren't getting raped behind closed doors?
Right.
And what if we are doing the work of the hands and feet of Christ and doing the best we can to protect the innocent?
Right.
Should that not extend beyond our borders and our walls? Should that not extend beyond the bounds of our church buildings?
Right.
Should not we also protect the innocent children that are being exposed to such debauchery before they have an opportunity to learn a proper ethical code? That it's a flawed argument. It's one that is somewhat compelling because it's emotionally stimulating. There's a lot of guilt and shame built into it for those who have been in an abusive or manipulative church setting.
Right.
But that doesn't give us an excuse to turn our backs on the innocent that are struggling in our community outside of the church.
Right. And we've talked about this previously. This would be
Mm.
way back in the day. Some of our earliest episodes, we discussed, the stats on some of those sexual abuse stories in the church as well, compared to, like, say, the public education system. Um, there's something like, I don't remember I don't have the stats in front of me, but there's thousands of abuse of sexual abuse allegations and proven allegations, many of them in the public education system, but there's only a very, very small handful each year within just the entire, like, greater church community. And that doesn't mean that either is okay, because it's not. But to your point, Michael, I think it's really easy to throw a punch at the church because the church usually doesn't punch back. And I'm of course being metaphorical here, but it's frustrating. I think this is where a lot of the people that were responding to Mike is, it's frustrating to see someone who's within the church kind of being like, you guys are, feigning outrage over this one thing. And another person actually did commented, and they made a point to mention how in his response to Tucker's story, he made a point to not mention what the event was that this pastor disrupted. And someone was kind of saying, like, say the event name. What event was he disrupting? You conveniently left that out. And so if you were to only read his thread, you would think that this pastor just came and interrupted some random event, but it was actually a drag queen story hour for little children. And you know, most people are not okay with that. It's been polled. The majority of people are not okay with that. And so I think there's a frustration that many members of the church see when they see someone who has a platform within the church kind of basically tell the people that are trying to be awake on the watchtower, who are saying, "Hey, I think the enemy might be moving closer." And they're like, "No, you're just imagining things. Like, stop ringing the alarm. Like, we're all sleepy. We don't want to wake up." Like, that's just what it feels like to me. And I think that's where a lot of individuals get really frustrated with.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's no easy there's no easy answer, because there's some validity to, you shouldn't overblow things. But again, like you mentioned, he mentioned all the sexualization of young girls, and it's kind of like, well, that's a result of a culture that's in decay, and that's kind of what we're trying to talk about when we bring attention to drag queen story hours, or um, you know gender transition surgeries for minors. Like, these are things that are becoming acceptable in our culture that should not be acceptable.
Yeah. The disturbing part, I think, about this whole story is that it's incomplete.
Yes.
And it's hard to make an actual assessment with good conscience without knowing the nature of the pastor's opposition. Because you could say, yeah, he's standing up against something that's clearly sinful and cool. It has certain John the Baptist vibes to it, very oppositional towards the governing sins.
Right.
But also, what if he did go in there and was blatantly disrespectful and cruel, and he could have been worthy of greater scrutiny than we'd like to think he is. That doesn't mean he's not justified in his opposition to what was taking place in a drag reading time. But I don't know. It gets difficult, because then I wonder if maybe we're not fighting hard enough against it. Maybe those of us who are comfortable sitting behind a webcam and talking about it ought to do more action in opposition.
Yeah.
Because it's easy. It's easy to talk to someone that agrees with me about it. It's a lot harder to sit there and be scrutinized not only by a room of opinionated adults, but also the law. So it's hard to not come to the conclusion that my hat's off to this pastor, no matter how he acted. But we don't know the full story, so it's hard to make a true, discerning, educated assessment of what is taking place and what the Christian response should be. But ultimately, the bottom line is he spoke out in protest, whether it was aggressive in nature or peaceful in nature. His protests were not only denied, and not only was he, you'd imagine if his protests were so incredibly vulgar or aggressive, he would have been escorted out by security or police at the time of the event. Since supposedly he was refusing to leave, and it's like, okay, well, where were the police when it was happening if he was refusing to leave?
Right.
How is it that they'd come to his door the next day and say, oh, by the way, what you were doing yesterday, your protesting was not acceptable because you were protesting the wrong thing.
Right.
Therefore, come with us, you're going to be charged and all this. Because that I can just hear Jordan Peterson's teeth grinding as he reads through some of this, because that's just a violation of free speech. And
yeah,
that's, from a governance perspective, just as disturbing in the free world as, I don't know, it's not as disgusting as what's taking place in these drag shows, but it's indicative of that cultural decay, just like you're saying.
Yeah. And Susie Q in the chat said, when the world holds to postmodernist relative standards, individual for each person, there is no actual standard to hold anyone to, which makes the church an easy target for criticism.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's no longer just. It's kind of like what we briefly touched on earlier, is that justice does not mean the promotion of happiness. Mm-hmm. Happiness is fleeting and temporary and usually flawed and a vice. So in relative morality, we have people who think that this makes me feel good, therefore this is right. This makes him feel good, therefore for you to stop him from doing this is wrong. That's not morality. It's not based in an ethical principle. It's not. If we're going to adopt relativism, then yes, it conforms to the mores of our society that have now deemed sexualizing children to be a social norm. And if that's our sense of morality, then we are so lost, and it's so heartbreaking.
It is.
But there are many who have defined our mores by biblical ethic, and even outside of biblical ethic, you can think of just the broad spectrum evolutionary benefits to society. How is it beneficial for children to be exposed to these things? How is it beneficial for adults to be exposed to men in thongs dancing and thrashing themselves around? How is it beneficial in any way to our culture or our evolution for men to engage in this practice anyway? Some might say it's an expression of an art form, but to what end and for what means? And in what way is this expression conducive to a structural society that is promoting unity, promoting success, promoting growth, and not even, because there's many people in that relativism camp that would not want societal growth, but surely they would want some semblance of order and progress.
Right.
Because that's what gets to me is like, okay, we come at it from a biblical perspective where things are clearly defined.
Right.
So from our biblical perspective, transgenderism, homosexuality, and drag is all outside of the realm of what is acceptable behavior within the life of righteousness. But if you want to abandon that entirely and say, let's say from an atheist or agnostic perspective of purely evolutionary benefit, what are the evolutionary benefits of this behavior? And I'm sure some people could pull something out of their butt. However, I don't get it. I don't understand it. I don't understand why there are people that see this as being beneficial. If it is an expression of art form or an expression of self, I can only see that it is defined in selfishness. The cardinal selfishness makes a man feel validated by getting the attention that he desires by over-sexualizing himself. And that attention feels good, therefore he continues to engage in it. And because it makes him feel good, then others are in support of it as well. But no matter what philosophy of social constructs that you can engage in, going back to whether it's the ancient Greek philosophers, even Carl Jung, looking at a variety of philosophers through all ages, I think egocentrism is vastly rejected as something of societal benefit. So, sorry, that's my tangent, because no matter how you look at it, it is not beneficial to our society at large. So it's purely selfishness.
Yep. I agree.
Cardinal sin, as we see it.
Yep. Once Upon a Reset in the chat said, we are blurring the line of what is an ethical principle and what is deemed a social norm.
Yeah.
I agree.